Hi, we're going to talk about inclusion this week because, in my opinion, inclusion is basically the foundation of everything we do in the field of special education and education for that matter. So, moving through this PowerPoint, I'm going to do my best to have my face here as well as the words. And basically, what I want to talk about first and foremost is that inclusive education is an attitude. So throughout this class, we're going to be talking about the IEP and how to collaborate with families, how to involve families in that decision making, as well as students. And one of the things that should always be at the very foundation of what we do and discuss is inclusive education, meaning that our classrooms and schools are open to all children with disabilities, without disabilities, families of children with disabilities and without disabilities. We are including all so that everyone has an opportunity to be educated. It's always focusing on giving every student the opportunity to learn. And one of the ways that we do that for students with disabilities is through an individualized education program, which is what you're going to be learning a lot about in this class. So one thing that should always be emphasized, and hopefully some of you might have already taken your Foundations of Special Education class, or you're in the process of taking it. So some of this might be repetitive, some of this might be new, but just to briefly talk a little bit about inclusive education, focusing on the fact that it's not where we simply dump students with disabilities into a gen ed class and just hope that they're able to make it and be successful. It's also not something where we have to cut back and kind of do a trade-off. For those of you who are going to be special education teachers or general education teachers or specialized teachers, speech language pathologists, etc., no matter what you do, you're always going to have to work with students with and without disabilities. So understanding that inclusive education is really a thoughtful process on how to include all children so they can learn. It is also, by the way, not sacrificing the education of students without disabilities. Sometimes people assume that if we have a student with a disability in a general education classroom, that it's automatically going to take away from the students who don't have disabilities. Not when you're doing it the correct way, and not when you know how to truly embrace inclusion. Special education, hopefully you've heard this already. If you haven't yet, it's not a place. And that's one of the foundations that is really important to understand and know when we work with students with and without disabilities, is that when we need to apply specialized services through an individualized education program, we need to realize that the IEP is not created to move a student into a different place than the general education. So we always start with general education, which is inclusive. We always start with all students learning together in the same classroom. And based on how a student learns, or if they have a particular disability that qualifies them for an IEP, then we need to sometimes look at creating, or then we do actually need to look at creating an IEP that provides specialized services for that student to be able to remain in the least restrictive environment with their peers. So one thing to really emphasize with what special education is, we know it's not a place, but what it is essentially is what I just described, having those individualized support so that students with disabilities have the opportunity to learn that general education curriculum with their typically developing peers, with either accommodations or modifications or any necessary changes to their services. That might include physical therapy, curriculum adaptations, communication board if they have communication challenges. It might include speech therapy services, language therapy services, a behavior intervention plan if there are some behaviors that are impeding their learning or the learning of their peers, and any environmental accommodations that might be needed to help that student be successful. So when a student who has a disability, when a student qualifies for having an IEP, it means basically they have to have one of the 13 eligible categories of disabilities under the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This, of course, is covered in the Foundations of Special Education course. So if you've already taken it, great. If not, you might want to look more into it to look at a little bit more into IDEA, specifically looking at those eligibility criteria. We will be talking a lot more about that throughout this class though. But basically in the United States, each student who has a disability and qualifies for special education services basically has an IEP that includes learning goals and objectives, services and supports that that student needs to be successful in the least restrictive environment, accommodations for the student, and to what extent the general education curriculum might need to be modified for that student, if and why the student will be out of the general education classroom and away from their non-disabled peers, their typically developing peers, that needs to be described in detail in the actual IEP. So again, we're really promoting inclusion. So one thing to keep in mind, that it's a quote I like from Glasser, is 10% of what we read is what we learn. 20% of what we hear we learn. 30% of what we see we learn. 50% of what we both see and hear we learn. 70% of what is discussed we learn. 95% of what we teach someone else is what we learn. So, going back to the idea of inclusion in the least restrictive environment and having students with and without disabilities educated together, this really comes from the social learning theory that we learn from watching each other and working with each other and teaching others. And so keeping that in mind, that's why we really want to promote typical and atypical developing students to work together so that they can have that partnership and really learn from each other. The general education curriculum under IDEA, it actually states, quote, this is straight from the law. I'm not going to read it verbatim to you, but it basically, we need to have measurable annual goals that include short-term objectives, and those goals need to be related to that student's needs. So when we have an IEP, basically it's a program where we're designing a program for a student with a disability on how they can best access the general education curriculum with their general education peers. It should always be tied to the general education curriculum. So you hear a lot about standards-based IEP goals and standards-based learning. And the reality is, first and foremost, the overarching governing board of educational curriculum for students with and without disabilities is the standards, is the grade level standards and all of those skills and knowledge and skills that we want students to learn. So every first grader needs to learn XYZ. Every second grader needs to learn XYZ. Those all apply to students with and without disabilities. So when we have an IEP and we really are embracing inclusion the way that it should be, we're always looking for that connection between the general education curriculum objectives and those students' IEP goals and objectives. So we want to help that student learn specific knowledge and skills that will help them achieve those grade level standards. The team, there's always an IEP team. The family and the student are very important members of that team. They need to learn and basically decide what the student will learn about each class subject that they're studying. They need to decide how many general education objectives might be taught. They need to look at functional and meaningful curriculum goals and outcomes for that student, and really keeping in mind what the class is learning. So when we write an IEP for a student, we want to ask ourselves, how do these IEP goals actually fit within that general education curriculum? We want to make sure we're always keeping those students who do have disabilities right aligned as close as possible as we can to their general education peers. IDEA was created about access for students with disabilities. There might be goals that are different, but they might need to be related. So you might have something where a student's goal is different than that of the general education curriculum, but it is recognized as related in a different way. So for example, if you're learning to recognize a triangle while everyone else is studying the angles of the triangle, student might not be ready to study those angles yet because they don't understand the concept of what a triangle is. So we want to focus on what those precursor skills are to get them to those general education curriculum goals that we want them to have. The student may need to be taught in a different way. So for example, sometimes we might need to we might need to accommodate a student by giving them access to the material in a different way. So instead of reading a text, they might be able to do a hands-on activity, or instead of listening to a lecture, they might be able to do something hands-on. A student who has a significant learning disability, like dyslexia, for example, instead of reading the text, they might be able to learn the text through audio. So it's a different delivery, but it's the same concept in terms of what we're teaching them. And then there also might be opportunities where a student might need to work in a different way. So for example, using a computer instead of a pen and pencil, etc. So I've mentioned the least restrictive environment probably quite a few times at this point, and hopefully you've heard this before, but this is essentially the environment where our students who do have an IEP are going to receive their services. And first and foremost, all students belong in the general education environment. That's where that inclusion, that whole inclusion discussion started with to begin with. What we want to do is start with our students in the general education curriculum, in the general education environment, and provide whatever accommodations or modifications we need for them to receive those services in that general education environment with their peers. So in the typical fourth grade classroom, having a student who does have an IEP in that classroom is very common, and it's very okay. Somehow in the past, over the years, people have led to themselves to believe that if you have an IEP or you have a disability, then you have to go to said disabilities classroom. So some districts might have an autism classroom, which some people might assume the minute a child is identified with autism, they must go to that autism classroom. Not necessarily. Remember, special education is not a place, it's services. And so we want to start with that least restrictive environment first. And if a student is not able to be successful in that general education environment with those necessary accommodations and modifications, and if this teacher is finding that they are changing the curriculum and maybe even schedule so much that it's almost unrecognizable in that classroom, then you might look into another environment that is the least restrictive for this student, and it might mean part-time in a resource classroom and general education, or in some situations, there are some students who do go into specialized classrooms. But again, you decide the place, very, very last conversation. First, we always want to describe the student's needs. The needs drive their services, and that drives their placement. And so we want to always have that first and foremost in mind. So basically, I just talked about this, what the law says about LRE. There's a lot of language here. Keep in mind this PowerPoint is going to be posted online for you to just go through on your own without me narrating it. But it's basically what I shared is that we are required to ensure the maximum extent appropriate children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled or typically developing. The words non-disabled, by the way, comes from the law. That's not my language. We always want to use people first language. But so you can go through this on your own, but just keep this in mind. And I know that some of it's cut off with this lecture, but that's okay. So more about the least restrictive environment. It always starts with the assumption that the student will be in the general ed classroom, as I said before. And like I said, if it doesn't work after making a lot of accommodations and modifications, then we might pull that student out for certain therapies or services or resources, etc. Only if other options fail should we actually then take that student out of the general education classroom and put them in a more restricted classroom that might be a classroom designed for students with behavioral needs, etc. So how does all of this fit within EDSE 203? Why am I talking about inclusion when your class is titled the Individualized Education Program and other components or something to that effect? Because it all starts with inclusion. Special education started back in 1975 when the Education for Handicapped Children Act for All Handicapped Children Act was passed because a group of families and students with disabilities were being denied education in their general education classrooms and schools. And because of that, we have found that people with disabilities are marginalized the most in our society. And so we have laws and procedures in place and advocates available, and educators are advocates, and families are advocates, and students are advocates. We have all of these resources available to ensure that our students are guaranteed a free, appropriate public education. And so throughout this class, we're talking about the Individualized Education Program because that is basically the designed program that we have to ensure that our students with disabilities are provided that education that they rightfully deserve. So hopefully that helps. make sense. And as we go through this class, you'll find more about the IEP. You'll learn more. It's wonderful to have you in class, and I look forward to talking with more of you in the future. Bye.